A very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on neuroscience of learning. For the next 1 hour, we will be talking about various aspects of neuroscience and how they relate to learning. I'm Deepthi Pandey and I'm one of your facilitators for the day. A very quick check before we move forward. If everyone is able to hear me and see the PPT on the screen. You can let us know through chat. I already see a response from Rupali, and I also see Gauri has raised her hand. So Gauri, would you like to come off mute or maybe type your question on chat? All right, great. Getting quite a few responses to say that the audio and the screen share is clear for everyone. All right, thank you. So with that, let's get started. And I'll very quickly introduce myself and my colleague Sneha for the day, and then she can take over and take us through the introduction to today's topic. So I'm Deepthi Pandey, and I'm the Principal Consultant of Training Services at Strentscape. And my colleague Sneha, who's an Organizational Behavioral Analyst at Strentscape, is joining me for the webinar today. Of course, like I said, for the next 1 hour, we will be looking at various aspects of neuroscience and see how those have an impact on learning. And of course, as HR and OD professionals, let's see how we can leverage that information and knowledge going forward. So I'll now hand over to Sneha. Sneha, you can tell us a little bit about Strentscape, do the introductions, and then we carry forward. Thank you.
So I welcome you all to this webinar on neuroscience of learning. Before getting into the topic of the day, I'll just introduce a bit about Strentscape. Strentscape is an organizational development and transformation company. We are headquartered in Bangalore, India. So we are a team of trained and certified facilitators, coaches, psychologists, instructional designers. We have in-house e-learning developers, marketing specialists, and sales professionals. So together we help organizations to develop and create mechanisms for development, motivation, commitment, and creativity that enables employees to give their best every day. We have offerings that are into 9 different buckets. We offer behavioral training. We do certifications, different certifications like this certification, ID certification, blockchain certification, etc. We also offer competency mapping. Also, we have, as I mentioned, we have in-house digital learning team. We also provide executive coaching, image consulting service, OD consulting. We also have psychometric assessments. We are partnered with John Wiley and also Central Test. And we also have technical training. Let me just hand over to Deepthi. She'll take through the webinar and I'll be handling the chats. We'll be addressing your queries.
All right, thank you so much for that, Sneha. So let's, before we get started, because this is a 1 hour webinar, we have limited time and we are connecting virtually. So few ground rules to get the webinar started. Of course, I would request everybody to stay on mute, to ensure that we don't have any background noise coming in to the webinar. Whenever you have a question, please feel free to type your question on chat. And like Sneha mentioned, she will be handling the chat for today. So any questions that come up, we will address on chat. We are of course going to keep the session quite interactive. So any thoughts, not just questions, but anything that you'd like to share, feel free to do so through chat. And in case at the end of the webinar there are any unanswered questions, please do write into us. We will be sharing our contact details. You can write into us and we will be happy to address any further queries at the end of the session also. With that, of course, let's get started. And here are some of the objectives for today's webinar. First of all, we are looking to understand what is neuroscience. We are in a 1 hour's time, we are not going to get into too much of detailed biology of neuroscience, but we are definitely going to try to understand the basics of neuroscience and see how that knowledge can help us in adult learning that most of us are engaged in. Secondly, we will compare the relationship between learning and neuroscience. We will also discover what happens in the brain when we are learning something new. What are the kind of changes that happen in the brain when we learn something new? And based on all this, we will also identify ways to enhance learning. At the end of the day, that's what we are really here for. We are here to see how this information or knowledge can help us in enhancing our learning engagements or in making them more effective. And that's going to be the final takeaway from the webinar today. So with that, let's quickly take a look at why learning neuroscience matters, for professionals like you and me. We are not doctors. We are not into understanding the human brain so much. We are here to most of us are engaged in adult learning, but then how can neuroscience help us there? Let's first look at the business aspect of it. As on today, the only way an organization can maintain their competitive advantage in a fast changing world is to outthink, outlearn, and outcreate the competition, which means we are really looking to work at a higher level of creativity and focus. And by gaining deep insight into how the brain functions, we can ensure that all of these aspects are working to our advantage within the organization. By understanding how the brain works, we can support people in learning, we can support people in creating new ideas, we can support people in better problem solving, so that they are able to adapt to their ever changing and evolving workplace. And that's essentially where neuroscience comes into the picture. uh, Past few decades have significantly enhanced our understanding of the human brain processes. We understand the neural systems better. We understand what happens in the brain better. And now, of course, till now, this research was restricted to application in the medical sciences, where people try to understand the brain function to help with medical disorders, with diseases. But now this learning is expanding, and we are now trying to figure out, because learning is a process that happens in the brain, we are now trying to figure out how we can use this information and knowledge in the field of learning and education as well. And that's the focus of today's webinar. I'm going to very quickly pause over here because I see that a couple of people have raised their hands. Gauri and Sini, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure, so maybe you want to come off mute if you have a question. I'm not able to follow. Gauri, I see you written something on chat. Not sure of your question though. Okay, all right. Let's continue. So a report which was published by the Royal Society of UK in the year 2011. Here is what the report told us about educational neuroscience. So first of all, what is education? Education is about enhancing learning, and neuroscience is about understanding the mental processes that are involved in learning. Both education and neuroscience are therefore the common area between both of them is learning. And that's the reason why, because of this common ground, the future suggests that the educational practice or the entire learning industry is going to be completely transformed because of this neuroscience. Just as the medical practice was transformed by scientific discoveries about a century ago, we can definitely see a lot of scientific study in the field of neuroscience having an impact on education and learning. Of course, another common term to describe educational neuroscience is brain-based learning. And any contemporary work, if you see today, we have things like brain-based coaching and learning. All of these are inspired by the research and study that's happening in the field of neuroscience. And that's the future. That's the future of learning, to leverage the knowledge of the human brain, to make learning more effective as we move forward. So let's look at very quickly what happens in the brain when we're learning something new. And, of course, 1 hour is too short a time to really understand the brain and its structure completely. It is such a complicated, part of our body. But we are going to talk about some very basics of the human brain, so that the understanding is a little bit clear in this 1 hour. So the first thing to know and remember is that the working memory that all of us have, uh, the working memory is the function of a part of the brain called as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is actually the area of the brain that is right behind the forehead, above the eyes. And it is this prefrontal cortex that is engaged in working memory. Now, what does working memory mean? Working memory relates to that part of the memory which deals with collecting new information, um, comparing it with what we already know, and then forming conclusions based on this comparison. That essentially is working memory, and that is the job of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, of course, takes care of higher brain functions that are voluntary, like thinking, which I was just telling you about. And because of this, the prefrontal cortex is also the most energy guzzling part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that requires a lot of oxygen and energy when it functions, because there is so much of processing that's happening in the prefrontal cortex. The second part of the brain that we will look at is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is located near the core of the brain, which will be closer to the spinal cord. And this requires much less energy to function. So as opposed to the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia does not really need a lot of energy. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the involuntary actions of the body are taken care of by the basal ganglia. And because these are kind of automated, so to say, they don't really require too much of energy from the brain. The brain doesn't really take big decisions when it's taking care of the involuntary functions. And that's why this part of the brain uses lesser energy. So, for example, your habits, which we form over a period of time. This is where the neural circuits of long-standing habits are formed and held, and that's the reason why, for example, you walk out in the dark and you hear a rustle in the bushes. Instinctively, you tend to think it's a snake. That kind of habit, which is coming into human beings from evolution, that is held in the basal ganglia. The third part of the brain that we are going to look at, of course, is the orbital frontal cortex. Now, what happens here? The human brain, of course, has over the years developed to detect errors. What are the errors that we are talking about here? Errors relate to the difference between expectation and reality. So whenever the brain figures out that there is a difference between the expectation and reality, there's an error, that is an error message that is triggered in the brain. And these error signals are generated by the orbital frontal cortex of the brain. Again, this is part of the prefrontal cortex actually, and this part of the brain is actually very closely connected to the amygdala. Now, for people who may have heard of parts of the brain, amygdala is one of the most commonly heard of terms. The amygdala is the emotional seat of the brain. The amygdala is the one that processes emotions, and one of the strongest emotions that human beings feel is fear. And therefore, the part of the brain that detects these errors is very closely related to the amygdala. In fact, every time the brain detects an error, there is also a surge of fear that comes in, because what we know, what we believe, if it is not in line with what actually is, there is a lot of actual chemical change happening in the brain. So these are the three parts of the brain that we are going to look at, and I'm going to leave it here for now. We will come back to what this information means for us as L&D professionals in just a little bit. Of course, a couple of other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the seat of memory in our brain. We have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of hippocampus, and each hemisphere is responsible for a certain type of memory. So, of course, the hippocampus also plays an important role in the entire learning process. While you don't see it here, the hippocampus is an important part of the brain that we are going to talk about as we go forward as well. So three parts of the brain very quickly: the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the orbital frontal cortex, and of course, in addition to this, we also have the hippocampus. So since we've understood the very basic structure of the brain, let's move forward and see what our brain is made of. And I'm going to throw this question out at the audience. Any guesses on what the brain cells are called? Like our entire body, the brain is also made up of cells. So a quick one, what are brain cells called? Great, okay, so we already have a lot of answers and a lot of right answers coming in. Yes, the brain is made up of cells called as neurons. And here is what a typical neuron looks like. So the neuron will have a cell body. It will have, an axon. It has axon terminals. And the most important part of the neuron are the dendrites, because it is these dendrites that connect with one another, and that's how information or stimulus or the processing happens in the brain. That's how information flows from one neuron to the other. It is with the help of these dendrites that you're also seeing on your screen at the moment. So the neurons, of course, are the basic, building blocks of the brain and the central nervous system. We have about 100 billion neurons in our brain, and each of these neurons has over a lakh of neural connections. So overall, we have about over 1 trillion neural connections and networks in our brain. Very difficult for us to comprehend what this really means, but from a number perspective, that's the kind of circuitry we are talking about when we are talking about our brain. So a lot of research, of course, initially, happened when we started studying the human brain. A lot of research went into it. And I'm going to refer to one such research which resulted in something called as the Hebbian laws, the Hebbian rules. Dr. Hebb studied the neurons and what happens to neurons when information is passed through them. And based on his study, he came up with these 3 Hebbian rules, which are actually given on your screen now. And the first Hebbian rule said that neurons that fire together wire together. So I'm going to very quickly go back to the structure of the neurons and tell you that whenever there is any flow of information, these dendrites of one neuron connect with the dendrites of the next neuron. This connection happens with an electrochemical surge that comes into the brain. So there is a flow of electrical current which passes through the various chemicals of the brain, and that's how these dendrites form connections with each other, and that's how the neurons get connected to each other. This connection between the dendrites of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, it's not a physical connection, but it's just the flow of that electrochemical signal. That's the connection that we're talking about. These connections are called as synaptic connections. And like I told you earlier, there are about a trillion synaptic connections, in our brain. So what happens is that when a neuron gets activated, there is this flow of electrochemical current that goes from one neuron to the other, to the next neuron. That's what you're seeing in the image right now. And that connection between these two neurons is called as the synaptic connection. So when two neurons fire together, they form a connection between each other, which we also called as wiring. So the first Hebbian rule is that neurons that fire together wire together. The second Hebbian rule is a very simple one again, because it says that neurons that do not fire together do not wire together. So whenever our body receives any kind of information, it comes to the brain through the five senses. And when the neurons get activated, all the neurons in our brain don't get activated at the same time. Remember, we have a few billion neurons. All of them don't need to get activated at the same time. So all the neurons that are not getting activated at the same time, the ones that are not getting activated together, they never form a connection with each other, right? And therefore, for example, when you think about your school, if I were to tell you to close your eyes for 30 seconds and think about your school, you'll probably think about things like the playground, the building, the friends, the teachers, maybe being punished and being sent out of classroom. But not many of us will think about an airport. The reason is that the neural network for an airport is a different one from the neural network of school, because they never got fired at the same time, so they never formed a connection with each other. And that's why even today, when you think about your school, you don't think about an airport. So that's essentially your first two Hebbian rules. The third Hebbian rule says that there is economy of real estate in our brain, which means that there is limited space in our brain. Why is there limited space in our brain? Because of course our brain is encased inside our skull. The skull is only a certain size, because the human beings have to be born through the birthing canal, and the skull cannot grow beyond that. So the brain is kind of limited by the size of the skull. Of course, over the years, from an evolutionary perspective, we have seen an increase in that size. But evolution takes millions of years to happen. So we are not going to see a change in the size of our brain in the coming 10, 20, 30 years. That's a long drawn process. And that's the reason why we have limited space in our brain. And therefore, we have to make the best use of whatever space and connections we have in our brain. Neuroscience also says that by the time a child is about 11 to 12 years of age, most of your neural networks are pretty set. We formed a lot of connections in our brain. And that's the reason why, as you keep growing older, it keeps becoming more and more difficult to learn new things, because the number of free neurons available to form these connections are lesser and lesser as we keep growing older. So essentially, these are the three Hebbian rules. Now, what does it mean in terms of learning? What it means is that since we have limited space in our brain, we need to make the best use of the existing connections. And that's why relating any new learning to something that a person already knows always helps. Because it also fires your existing neural networks. Firing an existing network is easier than creating a new neural pathway. It's a less energy consuming exercise. And that's why in learning, we say that try to connect anything new to something that people already know, and the impact of that learning will be greater. People will tend to remember that learning for a longer time. And the Hebbian rule is essentially your science behind what we are already doing, which is connecting new learning to something that people already know. Now, there are some other aspects of the human brain that we need to know about as well. And the two concepts that I want to now talk about are neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. These are, what latest research in neuroscience has told us about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. While the earlier belief was that as we keep growing older, the neurons in our brain, the old cells die, and they are not replaced by new cells. That was the traditional approach to the human brain, to understanding the human brain. But the latest research tells us that neurogenesis, which is the birth of new neurons, neurogenesis happens in our brain throughout our lives. Now, this particular aspect of neuroscience is very important as well, because this means that throughout our lives, we have the capacity to learn new things because new neurons are being born in our brain, and therefore we can continuously learn throughout our lives. Of course, the rate of neurogenesis drastically drops down. By the time a child is about 180 days, we have pretty much got most of our neurons, and the rate of neurogenesis really reduces after that. But neurogenesis happens throughout our lives. The second concept related to neuroscience, which is again a very, very important one, is called as neuroplasticity. And again, this is based on new research that has happened on the human brain. And this is a very, very encouraging aspect of the brain. Neuroplasticity essentially is the capacity of the brain to change itself, which means to change its structure and in fact even its function over a long period of time. Now, this is really interesting news, because what this means is that because our brain can continuously change itself, even if we have a certain neural connection or a neural network today, that neural network can be and will be modified over time. Good news, because if I was learning crawling as a child and now I don't need to crawl anymore, the neural network which was related to crawling will fade over time, because remember, the brain can change itself and a new learning can take its place. Now, this neuroplasticity again means that we do have a capacity to learn throughout our lives, and particularly for adult learning, that's a very, very encouraging thing to know. In fact, neuroplasticity also relates to brain injury. When a person has some kind of brain injury, or in fact some impairment like loss of sight, what neuroplasticity essentially does is that, number one, it repairs the brain to whatever extent it can, and number two, the parts of the brain, even though biologically they are assigned to a certain function, if that function is not using the entire capacity of the neurons, those neurons can be used for something else. So that's essentially what neuroplasticity is telling us. And from a learning point of view, that makes it very, very encouraging for us. It means we have great capacity to learn throughout our lives. I know we are talking about a lot of science here, but I'm going to pause over here and check if there are any questions. I see that a few people have raised their hands, and Gaurav is one of them. So Gaurav, is there would you like to ask a specific question? I would request you to please use chat if you have any specific question to ask. Okay, all right, no question there. So I'm going to pause over here and check if we are all clear on the understanding so far. We've understood the various parts of the brain. We've looked at neurons and how they fire and wire. And we've also looked at neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And essentially, at the end of all of this, what we are saying is that adult learning is possible. We can learn throughout our lives. And also that when we connect any new knowledge to existing knowledge, that makes learning easier and faster. That's what we have learned so far from neuroscience. Okay. Now let's move on and see what else is research telling us from a neuroscience perspective. And this is really interesting because now the focus of study, and there is a lot of groundbreaking research happening here as well, the focus of study has kind of moved from just studying the human brain and neurons in the brain to even the microbes that live in our body and particularly in our gut. And a lot of recent studies show that the microbes that are living in our body have an impact on learning and cognition and even moods. So today we talk about food and the body only from a health point of view, but in future we are going to look at it from a mind and learning point of view as well. To an extent we are already doing that. In fact, one such study, and I'm going to come back to the question which has been asked by Rajni. One study on the gut bacteria, which was done by Alexander Carlson and his colleagues, it showed that when they studied small babies from the age of 6 months to about 24 months, and they studied the different kinds of the bacteria that are living in these children, what they found was that the children who had more microbiomes, which means a higher level of variety of the good bacteria in the body, these babies had a higher level of cognitive ability at the age of 24 months as well. So the makeup of your body in terms of the microbes in the body also has an impact on the cognitive functions of humans. And that is really where the neuroscience study and research is going as on today. The study of the gut bacteria is still in its very nascent stages, so therefore I'm not going to go too much into that, but what I'm telling you is that from a futuristic point of view, we are going to see a lot more science coming into learning, and that can extend to not only the human brain and the neurons, but even to the bacteria that live in our body, and how we can leverage that for making learning more effective. I'll now come back to Rajni's question, which is a great one, which is that does neuroplasticity have any bearing on physical activity? Well, actually, not neuroplasticity itself. In fact, there is a lot of study out there which suggests that people who are more physically active tend to have a healthier mind and neurons as well. I was going through this really interesting video just yesterday about the neuroscience of learning, and it said that on a group of rats that were kept in these research laboratories, because a lot of research happens on rats. One of the researchers, what he did was he kind of changed the environment of these rats, because traditionally rats, they live in a small cage. You just do experiments on them, and that's pretty much it. And on an average, these lab rats, their life is about 3 years. On an average, they live about 3 years of age. Now, this one particular researcher, what he did was that in the rats in his for the rats in his laboratory, in the cage, he put in some toys in the cage for them. He also allowed the rats to, instead of keeping them in small individual cages, he kept them together in a larger cage. He gave them toys to play with, and a few interesting things came out from that study. Number one was that the life expectancy of these rats went up. And these rats, on an average, lived to up to 7 years of age instead of only 3. So physical activity and your physical health, of course, is directly related. Another thing that the research also found was that the number of synaptic connections in the brain of the rats that were more physically active was much more than the number of synaptic connections in the brains of the rats that were kept in barren cages alone. And this is really interesting because that kind of answers your question to say that does physical activity have an impact on how the brain is functioning? Definitely. And therefore the brain becomes more plastic, more open to change. It changes much more effectively when there is physical activity. So all right, so I see that Rajni, your question is slightly different, which is the references to learning ability in the later stages of life, especially if one were to try to learn a new physical activity. So are you? So I'm not sure if I'm getting your question right, and maybe we can connect later to discuss this in detail. But yes, even at a later stage in life, whether you're learning a new skill or a physical activity, it can be done because of neuroplasticity, because your brain is plastic. It changes throughout your lives, so new skill can be learned throughout lives. Learning new skills becomes easier for people who tend to be more physically active throughout lives. And we are going to look at another such similar experiment in a little bit, and I think that will answer your question a little bit better as well, Rajni. So I'm going to leave that there for now. We are going to park that for now. So that's the interesting stuff about the brain, the new research and study that's happening. Let's now look at what this essentially means for learning. And again, a lot of research has happened connecting neuroscience to learning these days. And a very popular model which has come up is called as the AGES model, the AGES model of learning, which essentially says that there are 4 basic principles of adult learning. And behind each of these principles, there is very interesting neuroscience as well. So the first aspect is that if you want to learn, the first step in learning something new is to grab the attention of the learner. While a little bit of distraction is always going to be there, and maybe sometimes it's even good, when a learner learns something with focus, with a single-minded focus, the learning is definitely more enhanced. Research has revealed that the amount of time it takes to complete a task when you're focusing your attention to it versus when you're doing the same task while multitasking, there is a huge difference in the amount of time it takes to do the same task. In fact, again, a lot of research, even in the field of neuroscience today, is saying that multitasking is essentially a myth. Human beings and our brain is not designed in a way to multitask effectively. We are inclined to believe that we can do multiple things at a time, but the cerebral cortex of the brain can only focus on one thing at a time, and that's what neuroscience is telling us. So when the brain shifts very quickly from one task to another task, it doesn't give the cerebral cortex enough time to make that shift, and therefore the learning somewhere suffers there. So the first thing to do is to have focused attention towards learning. The second aspect is that if you want learning to be effective, there has to be a generation of a personal context to the learning. If you want learning to be effective, the idea has to be generated personally for every learner in the working memory. What that means is that, we can tell people, we can give them generic information to go by, but if you really want learning to stick, that learning has to have it has to generate a personal context for the individual. The individual needs to know what that learning is going to do for him or her, and only then that learning becomes impactful. So people have to be allowed to create their own mental links. People have to be allowed to have their own aha moments, because everybody's neurons are going to fire in a different way. So if you want learning to be effective, you have to allow people to generate a unique context of that learning for themselves, and then that learning is going to be effective. In fact, adult learning, in that sense, is very different from child learning, and this is one of the principles that makes adult learning so different, which is that when an adult is working something which is self-directed, that learning works for adults, because that learning allows the adult to generate a stronger neural network for that particular learning, and that essentially is what we mean by generation. The third aspect of learning is, of course, that emotions play a very, very important role in learning. We know that emotions and memory are interlinked. Um, you know, um, People also say, neuroscience also shows as of today that emotions are the currency of memory. If you remember earlier, we talked about, the hippocampus being the seat of memory, and we saw that the two hemispheres of the hippocampus, the right and the left, are responsible for two types of memory. So one is your memory related to facts and figures, short-term memory, and the other is your episodic memory, which is related to creating the stories, life stories in your mind. And what neuroscience tells us today, that it is very easy for us to forget the facts and the figures, but the episodic memory is something that remains with us for a longer time. In fact, if any learning is accompanied by a strong emotional connect or reaction, that memory remains longer in our mind, because then not only your hippocampus but also your amygdala gets involved in the memory. And we know that if your memory is going to be using only one or two parts of the brain, that memory is easier to lose. But when larger parts of the brain, many more parts of the brain are involved in some kind of a memory, that memory tends to remain with us for a longer time. So emotions definitely do have a great impact on learning. And that's the reason why, today in L&D, we see the use of storytelling. Why is storytelling so effective? Because it evokes certain kind of emotions in people. And we know that with emotions, your amygdala and hippocampus both are going to be activated, and therefore the learning is going to remain in people for a longer time. And the final part of the ages model is spacing. And essentially what we mean by spacing is that, if you want learners to learn something and remember it for a longer time, you have to really space out your learning. And this again particularly holds true for, the adult learners. So what neuroscience also tells us is that, the human brain is designed to forget a lot of things, particularly the irrelevant things. So a German psychologist, his name was Hermann Ebbinghaus, he came up with a theory called as the forgetting curve. And what he said is that after learning takes place, we tend to forget almost 50 to 80% of all the information that we have learned within a few days of when the learning has taken place. And now, if this learning is not repeated in that time, we will actually lose even more of that learning, more than 80% of that learning, if we don't repeat it. So what he said was that spacing out your learning and repeating it a number of times can increase the retention by even 200%. And that is again something that neuroscience is telling us, because the more we repeat a learning, remember, the more your neural network is getting fired again and again, and the stronger that neural network keeps becoming. The stronger a neural network is, the harder it is for that neural network to fade away. So when we say that, this particular habit is hardwired in me, we actually literally mean hardwiring, which means that the neural network of that particular habit is much, much stronger than for anything else. So if you want your learning to stay for a longer time, space out your learning, make it shorter, and repeat it a number of times. That is what will make learning effective. I'm again very quickly going to pause over here. I see a lot of thoughts coming in on the chat. Very quickly pause over here to allow you all to reflect on what we have just talked about and see if you have any further questions. So I see one question that was directed at me. Sorry, while taking you through the new model, I missed out that question. And this question is from Gaurav, which says that, so what you mean, Deepti, is that if mental health is good, you're healthy, in short. Um, Actually, Gaurav, what we are saying is the other way around. What we are saying is that if your physical health is good, if you're physically fit, you tend to be mentally fitter also, because your neurons tend to be healthier when you're physically healthy and fit as well. So while both of them are related, a slight difference, which is that your mental health depends on your physical health. And in fact, the study on the gut bacteria is going to strengthen, as of now, it looks like it's going to strengthen our belief that what we eat and how we treat our body has an impact on how effective our mind is in the functioning. All right. So that's your ages model. And let's very quickly now take a look at some of the strategies that we can take away from the ages model to make our learning more effective as well. So if you want strategies for attention, if you want to grab the attention of people, what are some of the strategies that you can use? The very interesting, again, some researchers have found that essentially there are two modes of thinking. There is the focused mode of thinking and the diffused mode of thinking. And both are equally important. So there were a couple of researchers from the University of California, Dr. Barbara and Dr. Terence, and they have a very popular course called as Learning How to Learn. And in that course, what they say is that the two approaches to learning are the focused approach. Essentially, the focus mode is when your cortex, the prefrontal cortex, is immediately and completely focusing on one thing. And when the focus mode is on, it's like, a flash of light that happens, and suddenly there is an aha moment, and you completely understand and learn something very quickly. So the focused mode is when your prefrontal cortex is completely focused on learning something. Then the other mode of learning is the diffused mode of learning. Now, the diffused mode of learning is when you allow your brain to relax and you allow the different parts of the brain, not just the prefrontal cortex, but you allow the different parts of the brain to engage and wander. And this relaxation also provides valuable insights by engaging more parts of your brain than the focused learning. So essentially what neuroscience is telling us that both focused and diffuse learning are equally important. Both types of learning happen. And if you want learning to take place, make use of both these strategies. There are times when you want to bring people's focus to something very quickly, and there are times when you want to allow people's brain and mind to wander so that they are able to learn as well. Very simple examples, like if I'm asking people to reflect, answer something, do a reflection sheet, that's more of the focused learning. But when I'm asking people to get into a brainstorming session where we are allowing people to explore, that's more of your diffused mode of learning. Both of them have different kind of value, and both of them are coming from neuroscience, that these two types of learning do exist and they do work. The next is the determinants of attention. Of course, if you want to get attention of people, there are various factors that can help in getting attention. Things like the color, shape. If I'm taking you through a PPT and suddenly something is, given in a different shape or a different size or a different color, that immediately gets attention of people. And that's where your prefrontal cortex is focusing attention. So basically grabbing attention, there are different strategies that we can use also. Vinod, I think you have a very interesting question about, millennials. So strategies, pretty much remain the same, but the way in which you will engage different kinds of people will be different. In fact, this is slightly controversial, but what neuroscience is also saying is that instead of generalizing and looking at groups of people on how they learn, whether it is from the perspective of millennials or the learning styles, instead look at the brain functions of an individual and design learning for the brain, not for a millennial or for a kinesthetic learner or a auditory learner. That's what neuroscience is saying as of now. But of course, for some time to come, we are still going to focus on looking at millennials differently and looking at different learning styles differently. But neuroscience is saying that you should design learning for the brain and not bucket people together from a group point of view. All right, moving on to strategies for generation. How do you generate that individual context for a person? How do you allow people to personalize learning for themselves? From an adult learning perspective, of course, tell people what's in it for them. Give them ideas of immediate application of the learning, the relevance of that learning in the job, and also capitalize on their strengths. Particularly from a behavioral point of view, we are looking to work with the strengths of people rather than weaknesses. Because also when we talk about weaknesses, from a neuroscience point of view, there is an immediate perception of threat. The kind of chemicals released in the body will not allow people to learn when they perceive threat. And that's why the learning has to focus more on strengths rather than weaknesses. And learning also has to have an immediate application. Very quickly moving on to strategies for emotions. Very important, giving immediate and meaningful feedback. In fact, again, there has been a lot of study over here where two groups of people were given feedback in a different manner. One group was given feedback which was more positive, and another group was given feedback which was a little more negative. And guess which feedback stayed with people for a longer time or made them consciously change. It was the positive feedback, because again, your amygdala will get triggered the moment you receive positive or negative feedback. But the moment the amygdala gets triggered, and if there is a perception of fear or threat, the focus of the person goes on dealing with that threat rather than on constructively working towards the learning. So if you want to engage your emotional brain, or if you want to engage your amygdala in a more positive manner, you need to provide more positive feedback to people. Similarly, like we said earlier already, use storytelling, because storytelling evokes emotions in people, and that's a great way to learn as well. Finally, strategies for spacing, and we know this, because a lot of new learning is happening like this. Make sure that learning is repetitive. In a span of time, people are repeating the same learning again and again, because their neural network, their neural connection is going to become stronger. Chunk information, make sure that your information is pieced together, where similar information is given at the same time, because that will make the neural connections easier. And finally, use microlearning, small bite-sized learning nuggets. Don't expect people to sit through an 8-hour learning program, because the brain cannot focus on learning for that long. Make your learning short and impactful. Again, we are already doing these things as L&D professionals, but now we know that there is neuroscience behind whatever we are doing. I'm going to again, very quickly talk about one more principle, and this is coming from something called as neuro leadership. So, David Rock, the person who has done a lot of breaking work in neuro leadership, where he says that neuroscience is, going to impact leadership in the workplace as well. And based on his research, David Rock essentially talks about three main principles, where he says that focus is power. And that's essentially what we've been saying so far as well. The act of paying attention to something, it releases certain chemicals in our brain. It results in some physical changes in our brain, which makes learning more effective. So that's the first one. The second is that attention density shapes identity. Basically, when you, over a period of time, when you repeatedly do something again and again, um, that will have a more long lasting impact on behavioral change. And from a leadership perspective, that's very important. And finally, expectations shape reality. So whether we like it or not, people's preconceived notions, their biases, etc., have a huge impact on learning as well. So when we are trying to teach people, if we don't focus on what are their preconceived notions, what kind of biases are they coming with, the learning impact for an individual will never be very high. So these are basically the principles of David Rock's. There are a couple of more principles also by David Rock's. And one of them is that change is always going to be painful. Organizational change, whether we like it or not, is always going to be difficult. And one of the reasons is neuroscience. Because the moment, remember, when we are doing something out of habit, the part of our brain that is working is the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia requires less energy. But the moment we look at something new or we look at change, then the prefrontal cortex of the brain gets engaged, because then the brain has to compare what is new with what is old, see what is good for me, how do I compare the two, how do I make the best of this new thing. And therefore the prefrontal cortex, that is what gets engaged. And the prefrontal cortex requires more oxygen and more energy. So even physically, dealing with something new is always difficult, because from a neuroscience perspective, two very different parts of our body are engaged with habits versus doing something new. So that's a little bit about neuro leadership. And I think we have about 3 minutes left in the webinar, in which I want to again do a very quick experiment, take you through a very quick experiment with you. This is similar to the rats experiment that I already told you about. So this was a study which was done by Dr. Fred Gage in California, where he divided rats into 3 different groups. The group A rats were kept in a barren cage and they were very well fed. The group B rats were optimally fed, but there was a puddle of water, which means it was a life-threatening situation for the rats, because rats are scared of water. And the group C rats were also optimally fed, and but there were toys with them. Now, what Dr. Gage wanted to study here was which of these rats would have the most number of neurogenesis, which means new neurons being created in the brain. And what his study actually showed was that group C had the most neurogenesis. Now, there are a few reasons for it. One is, of course, the rats were engaged in physical activity, whereas the rats in the group A were not engaged in any physical activity. So group C has more physical activity, so more neurons, more neurogenesis. The second very important factor that comes out from the study is that now both group B and group C had physical activity. But in group B, the physical activity was related to saving yourself from the puddle of water, which means it was a life-threatening situation. But in group C, the physical activity was related to playing with toys. And of course, what the study found was that when you are dealing with a life-threatening situation, your learning ability actually goes down, because the focus of the brain the amygdala kicks in, the hippocampus kicks in, and the focus of the brain is to save yourself from the puddle of water rather than to learn anything new. Whereas when you're in a safe environment, when you're playing, when you're enjoying what you're doing, more parts of the brain get engaged, and that's where learning is more effective as well, and there is more neurogenesis as well. So Rajni, to answer your question, in this study we actually saw that there was more neurogenesis for rats who were more physically active, and therefore yes, if you're more physically active, your brain is healthier as well. And that's very important for us to remember in our learning sessions, our learning interventions as well. So very quickly to recap, physical exercise and movement wires the brain to make it more effective. There are more connections in the brain when we are more physically active. Social conditions influence our brain as well. Poor social conditions, or when we are not dealing with other people, when we are not learning from our environment or from people around it, the learning tends to be poorer. And chronic stress also has an impact on the performance of the brain, because sustained stress will never result in higher learning. Sustained stress will always result in only dealing with the stress but never in learning. So that's pretty much what we had to offer in terms of neuroscience and learning. I know it's been a short 1 hour webinar on the brain, which is so complicated. Yes, Sumant, you're right that the group B would probably have too much of adrenaline and therefore lesser learning as well, more adrenaline rush than required. So remember that we need to design for the brain and not for the learning style. That's what neuroscience is saying as of now. Let's see where the study goes in future. Before we close, very quickly, I know that Sneha has been continuously answering your questions, but do feel free to ask any more questions. You can contact us if you have any further information that you need, any question that has not been answered yet. Do feel free to write to us or call us. And finally, we have our upcoming DISC certifications and instructional design certifications. A lot of what we do at Strengthscape is based on neuroscience. Both DISC and ID, rely heavily on neuroscience. So do join us for these certification programs that are coming up. And you can avail a 5% discount for these certifications by using the code CERT5. The details are on your screen. So thank you all very much for being a part of this 1 hour intensive workshop on the neuroscience of learning. It was great having all of you here. Great to have all your questions. Of course, there's so much more we can talk about where the brain is concerned, but maybe for another time. Thank you and have a good evening.